I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 31st episode of this podcast dedicated to the improvement of your own brain by any means that I can come up with on a week-to-week basis. If you stick around until the end of this episode, you're going to get to hear something that almost, like even my close friends and family never get. You're going to get an actual television show recommendation from me, which is really weird. It's a sports television thing, and I'm not really a very big sports fan, and I'm in fact a violent opposer of television normally, so this is like the weirdest of things for me to recommend, but that's why it's worth being the ruthless listener retention gimmick. The main meat of this episode is going to be sports-related also. We're going to be talking with Jason Sada of Axon Sports, where they have really high-level training for elite athletes, a lot of like professional baseball players and football players and stuff like that are basically looking to gain every possible advantage they can for their athletic performance, including, in this case, what they're calling training from the neck up. I think I have their slogan right. Basically, brain training in the interest of getting absolutely peak athletic performance. Just one more example of people that are tearing apart this idea of the whole brain-body dichotomy that we have in the West, and in this case showing that to get the highest level performance out of the body, they really also need the highest level performance from within the brain. But before we get into any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
In a increasingly inaccurately named This Week in Neuroscience, we actually found an interesting article from March 12th, 2010, which is a couple years ago in neuroscience, but this was an article about the first direct evidence of neuroplastic changes following brainwave training. So this was interesting. We've had a couple of episodes about neurofeedback, and neurofeedback is something that's been around since the 1970s, but it's always been a question as to just how valid this is as a method of brain training, whether it's really doing something, how much of it's placebo, how much of it is digital snake oil or whatever. But this was a study that was done by the University of Goldsmiths and the Institute of Neurology in London. And they were doing a form of neurofeedback that was based not on, the feedback wasn't coming via audio, but was actually coming through video sources. So people were watching something, they could see what their brainwaves were doing visually, and they were, I guess, intentionally trying to reduce alpha brainwaves for a period of about a half an hour. After that period of about a half an hour, there was measurable changes in their cortical excitability and intracortical function. Yeah, despite the fairly long history now of neurofeedback as a brain training methodology, this was the first time that they had really open and shut evidence that it's actually doing something, and it's doing something in a short time frame. Half an hour to have measurable changes at a lasting biological level is pretty interesting, and I think pretty impressive.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so we're about to dive into the main interview now with Jason Sada of Axon Sports. This episode, I guess I want to call back attention to our episode a few weeks ago with Dan Hurley, the author of Smarter. Now, if you remember Dan, he was trying to improve his fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is kind of what we really think of when we think of somebody saying, I am so smart, or that person is so smart. It's kind of a very pan-disciplinary sort of intelligence, the idea that not only are you good in conversation, but you might be quick at learning something new. You might be able to figure out puzzles quickly or pick up a new language fast, rather than just being really good at one thing. Like that person can play the piano really well and clearly has some neuronal capabilities built around that skill, but that doesn't necessarily make him any better at speaking fluent Pig Latin. So in this interview with Jason Sada, we're going to be talking about the processes that his company uses to improve athletes' brains, but for very, very specific skill sets, things that wouldn't necessarily transfer well. You know, he's not looking to make people smarter per se. He's looking to improve very specific athletic capabilities, and that's what people are coming to him for. It's just worth bearing in mind because, you know, this is generally a podcast about how to make yourself smarter. This one is a little bit more focused on how our brains can be used to build performance, but that performance in this case isn't necessarily analogous to what we would call intelligence. Nevertheless, really super interesting interview, and I think really on point for the things that we're all interested in.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Axon Sports was launched in August of 2010 to bring some cognitive testing programs here to the U.S., specifically around concussion management. The standard protocol around cognitive testing is to identify impairment, where a standard baseline test is done when an athlete's brain is, if you will, healthy. If that passes that baseline, it serves as a metric with which you can compare any post-event performance against, such that when you have an event after physical symptoms have gone away, you have another metric, another test that can give you an identification if there seems to be some form of residual impairment of the brain. Axon was focused really on that, and around 2011, I had actually come into Axon to start looking at the opportunity to train the brain. We have a internal mantra, if you will, that we believe in sports the brain matters. It must be protected and it can be trained. So when I came in, we started work on some research and identifying opportunities within neuroscience to find ways to train athletes' brains and ultimately to learn more about the athletes' brains and identify where there's opportunity to help athletes improve their performance. And that's something we've been focused on and really activating over the past several years, starting with some real key engagements that we did early on with some high-performance facilities.
You began as establishing these baselines, sort of pre-concussion or pre-event. Have you seen, since you've been doing the brain training, any times when people are actually, better after their last checkup rather than worse?
Well, what's interesting is we haven't looked directly at any ties to cognitive performance, as in performance improvement and of the skill nature,
sure,
relative to recovery from injury. But one thing we learned very quickly is that the opportunity to do an assessment, to essentially assess where an athlete's cognitive skills are at relative specifically to their sport and their position, is always serves as a great starting point to then identifying the areas we need to train an individual athlete. So although on the training side, our baselines are not done in the context of measurement of impairment or as a baseline to compare against for measurement of impairment, what it serves for us is a great indication of the starting point, if you will, of an athlete's cognitive skills.
Mm-hmm. Looking at your website, there's this great graph here that has the 3 levels of, fundamental cognitive processing on the inside, working out to athletic cognitive skills, and finally athletic cognitive skill consolidation, which looks like that's sort of the 1, 2, 3 process that you're working to take people through. Could you talk us through each one of those stages?
One of the first things we did, and I'll get a little bit historical here on the process we went through, but I think it's important because it really defines how we learned where to focus our efforts. As you know, and I'm sure every person you have on your show would validate, the brain is incredibly complex. The more we learn about the brain, the more we realize there's more to learn. And so we wanted to really start at a very significant, if you will, place where we could build a core architecture. So one of the first things we did is we met with and evaluated some of the science of a lot of different practitioners around neuroscience, and in particular practitioners that were and researchers that were doing very practical implementations around the brain. And in that exercise, one of the things we really tried to define was what makes up an athletic brain. What are the components that drive the athletic brain purely from a neuroscience perspective? And then what we did is we met with the sports science experts, because the way we view sports is that there's a significant amount of science involved. On a football field, although there are play diagrams, there are certain responsibilities, schemes, and everything that each of the teams run, the reality is, physics is strongly at play. An athlete whose body is directionally pointed in a certain area, regardless of their speed, strength, and acceleration, et cetera, have to make a physical change to get to a different part of the field. So we know that there are very key elements of sports science that are unique to each of the sports, typically are founded in physics in some capacity. But what we thought was the best starting point for learning how to assess and train the athletic brain is to marry, if you will, sports science with neuroscience, so that we could start identifying the very significant differences in the science of the game, the science of not only the game, the sport, but the position, and then leverage that with the science of the brain, focusing primarily initially on how the brain learns. So it's a real unique approach that we took, which is really to leverage the science in both those categories. And out of that exercise, we came up with what we defined as the athletic brain. So one of the real interesting first steps that we did was we talked to a lot of athletes, premier elite level athletes, down to high school level athletes, and uniformly athletes agreed that the brain is critical in sports. They also uniformly agreed that it's critical because it controls everything you do.
Sure.
And then they all universally agreed that they don't know how to train it. So that's when we realized, okay, we really need to focus in on really defining something tangible here around the athletic brain, so that as we're describing the processes, as we're implementing the systems, there's a nomenclature, if you will, that's applied to it. So the definition we came up with, the athletic brain, has 6 components, and I'm just going to walk through those 6 just to give you a feel for the sort of underlying architecture we built around this that led us then to that 3-step process. The first part of this, the definition that we derived of the athletic brain, is really one of the most critical elements to most every athlete, and that's high-speed decision making. What's interesting about high-speed decision making is it's not just about being right, and in particular in sports or really any high-performance industry, it's about being right and being incredibly fast. The process that an expert, if you will, goes through to make a decision, a critical decision, in most cases can't be described by the expert, is driven, if you will, in their subconscious. And so what we look at are fundamentally, in almost every sport we deal with, how do we identify the decisions that an athlete needs to make, and then how do we start working with them to train those so that not only are they accurate, but they're fast. And a lot of times in film rooms and other areas in sporting organizations, people will be asked questions while looking at footage that isn't representative of what they see on the field. So when given the opportunity to see more information with a large perspective, if you will, of the field, coupled with a lot of time to formulate an answer, which in the sports world is measured in seconds, a lot of athletes can make accurate decisions.
Right, but it's totally non-representative of what they're actually going to see in gameplay.
That's exactly it, in several ways. One is the perspective. The other is just simply the time and the reality of you're going to have 20, 30, hundreds, thousands of conflicting priorities, emotional loads, physical loads, a lot of activity in the brain in a game situation. So at almost the core of our programming, we target the enabling athletes to have a very high speed and highly accurate decision-making process.
Can you go into how that training actually works?
For the most part, what we look at is a system where we are presenting scenarios that, again, through sports science, we've identified are the critical scenarios and representations that athlete, and specifically that athlete at that position, need to make. And then we assess their ability to not only recognize an answer either accurately or inaccurately, given larger amounts of time and information, and then we work our way through the assessment to having significantly less information and less time to answer. Athletes will fall into some range within that spectrum of these skills, and we look at multiple skills. So one of the elements which is, again, part of the athletic brain is a skill of pattern recognition and spatial reasoning. I'm sure you've had plenty of people on the shows that have talked about that cognitive skill. One element that's really critical in high-speed decision-making is how much information are you given? And so with pattern recognition and spatial reasoning, in sports, it's not just a matter of what pattern you're seeing, but the subtle nuances of that pattern. For example, if a player is in the middle of the field and is angled outward, their body is shifted, if you will, slightly outside. For an athlete to make a high-speed decision on that information, they have to analyze and almost predict what physical movement's going to come from that position, which may be significantly different than if there was no representation of how the athlete was standing. Mm-hmm. So that spatial relationship is really critical. And one thing we know about the expert performers is they're able to see those subtle nuances in these scenarios with less information. And internally here, we call that encoding efficiency. The term chunking, right?
Yeah.
It fundamentally is that. It's that if you're able to chunk the information in large blocks of useful information, as opposed to a large volume of small bits of information, you'll process the information more quickly. And so what we leverage in our high-speed decision-making is we present these scenarios and we vary the amount of information we provide, always ensuring that at our highest levels, that the amount of information we provide is enough information to make a decision. So the way the system works, an athlete comes in, we assess them, we identify their accuracy, their speed under varying skill sets, under varying conditions of timing requirements, when there's more or less pressure, and then also with varying levels of information. And so that produces for us an accuracy metric, a speed metric, and then an encoding efficiency metric.
Let me interrupt real quick with a question, because
Sure.
I get the sense that most of your clients are really like professional level, or at least like high end college level athletes, like really very elite performers. I'm wondering what you've seen as far as sort of the range of these sorts of abilities. Are people already clustered at a super high level when they come in, based on the fact that they've probably been training in these sports for at least a decade in most cases, or is there a pretty broad range?
Yeah, it's a great question, because what we consider very significant finding, if you will, in what we do is when we're able to identify differences amongst the best. It's part of the reason why we started with the elite athlete base. We wanted to identify, is there a significant range of performance amongst the best?
Yeah.
And what we found is that clearly, if we took a young high school player, and put them through the types of assessments that we put, let's say, an NFL player through, there's going to be a significant performance difference between the young performer and the elite athlete. Massively significant, because they haven't had to make those types of decisions at the levels they've played at. But then within the elite population, we see a significant difference between the players. We see a significant difference even within the collegiate ranks, where we looked at how many years an athlete had been in the system. And then we compared that to, okay, during those number of years, how many snaps or how many plays did the players actually play? And we see a correlation between the amount of plays that they played and their performance. So we do see significant difference at the elite level. The assessments and the training that we do are significantly relevant, if you will, to the level of the athlete. In other words, preparing a younger athlete to do and identify scenarios and recognize situations that exist at the professional levels isn't necessarily going to prepare them to be a better high school player, because they're never going to see those. And so I think why we see the differentiation at the elite levels is the specificity, if you will, of the scenarios that we create, and the amount of information that we vary providing to the athletes.
First of all, it was interesting that when you were interviewing athletes, they all agreed on the importance of the brain, but they as a group said, hey, we have no idea how to train this darn thing. Obviously we're all training our brains constantly, just sort of as we go through the world and make decisions and expose ourselves to things. But I guess the difference is, it's like if you're trying to train your muscles and you can see your bicep growing or whatever it is, it's like you have sort of a feedback loop, and it's very easy to measure progress. Whereas even though our brains are making progress, we don't normally have the tools to directly measure that, and that's a lot of what you're providing with people. But is the training process essentially just like more high speed decision practice than you would normally be able to get in a game situation? How does that actually work?
Yeah, that's a part of it, and certainly where we realize that optimizing the brain, if you will, in sports or in any high performance domain is a process, and we're going to learn more and more as we go through these over the years and learn more about the brain, more about sports. And that's a lot of the sort of forward-looking research we're doing is around other areas outside of high-speed decision-making, things like motor imagery, emotional regulation, ways to manage emotions. But certainly within the high-speed decision-making realm, if we go now to that three-step process that we defined and we had the visual on our site about, this is the process that we follow to effectively train, if you will, cognition and decision-making. Is we start with this core, which is a healthy brain. At the onset of this training, we essentially want to start with an athlete who's not impaired from some injury or some sort of cognitive incident. Then from there, we essentially build out these cognitive skills, which are mostly built around high-speed decision-making, but also a motor response. And we focus on those cognitive tools that we identified around the athletic brain. So we present scenarios that stress, if you will, the pattern recognition and spatial reasoning skills. We also look at situations and categories of decision-making that require anticipation. Anticipation is a really interesting one to me, because you hear of reaction, and if you in our athletic brain model, we coupled anticipation with reaction, because at the end of the day, I think everybody understands that reaction would be a good thing. And certainly athletes want to sign up for reaction to get faster reaction times. But the reality is the great athletes are able to anticipate and leverage that anticipation to then react quickly. We use a lot of examples of great athletes that weren't particularly fast, weren't particularly strong, but dominated their position or dominated their sport. And they always just happen to be at the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
It's a significant component of cognition to be able to anticipate. So although anticipation leads to a high-speed decision, it's using a different part, if you will, of the athletic brain. So through the way we develop the scenarios and the engagements, we're able to train these various skills. So within this section 2 that we call it, which is the athletic cognitive skills, we focus on the development of those skills in what we call a quiet environment. So we don't provide any distractions. We are fundamentally at that point training the skill of making accurate high-speed decisions with a very high encoding efficiency. So almost all of our scenarios will provide less information than the real world ever provides you. And then we continuously reduce that information so that an athlete has some cognitive flexibility to be able to make accurate decisions, accurate responses under varying conditions. But we do that in a quiet environment because we want the athlete to be refining, if you will, that skill. And to your point about the working out and maybe doing curls and seeing the impact on your biceps, there is no, on the field, if you will, or even in practice, really concrete measurement of your cognitive skill, your decision making, which at the end of the day is the output of pattern recognition, anticipation, focus, all of these things. The output is a decision.
Right.
And so some of the constraints that athletes are under are, number one, to get a very good representation and development of that skill. In a lot of sports, like soccer, for example, you need 21 other people. You need to be playing. And that's the absolute best way to get practice at decision-making in sports. A couple of the disadvantages of that, obviously, are availability of players, risk of injury, and you're not getting the feedback real time. So when we focus on these athletic cognitive skills, what we're trying to develop within an athlete is a foundational component within the brain that leverages pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, anticipation and reaction, imagination, filling in the blanks, if you will, and all of these parameters in a quiet environment. What we then try to do is consolidate those skills. The real world is filled with distractions. The real world is not a quiet place. And so what we then want to be able to do with the athletes is, if you will, fortify that skill or consolidate it by applying distractions. And it's always interesting when we look at how to develop an emotional load, if you will, or a focus load on an athlete. And, those vary by athletes, what affects them more, what affects them less.
I was going to ask, because it seems like, from person to person, the things that one finds distracting are probably going to vary a lot.
They absolutely do. But what we try to identify is the fact that when you're distracted, your brain is allocating resources toward that distraction. So what we try to make as a more objective, if you will, metric to train within is we go with some standard visual and auditory type distractions such that the consolidation that's happening is that these decisions that were done in a very high speed and highly accurate manner in the quiet environment are still extremely accurate and still extremely high speed, even though we know your brain is allocating resources toward a distraction. Mm-hmm. One really interesting thing that's always intriguing to me is a lot of times people will mention crowd noise I bet that's one of the big distractions in sports. And just about every athlete we've ever talked to, and a lot of our companies made up of athletes, no one hears the crowd noise. It's white noise.
Yeah.
And you may feel it. Emotionally, you may feel energized by sort of the volume and the, if you will, atmosphere created by crowd noise. But it very rarely takes you off task. And so, it's more these pointed incidents, in events, if you will, that take you off point. So what we try to do in this consolidation stage is maintain that high performance under what we call loads.
Can you tell me about what some of, again, in the environment of your offices when you're doing these training, what do you do to create these loads?
So it's all programmatically generated.
Yeah.
And so an athlete is in an interactive screen.
Mm-hmm.
Touch screens are a vehicle that we use in a large percentage of our training.
Sure.
And as they're training and responding, there will be stimulus through sound, through headphones, or visually on the screen that require a response. So it's interesting because we looked at distractions, and there really are two. There's a lot of categories of distractions, but there are both relevant and irrelevant distractions. There are distractions in this world that bring no value to your decision making. An example of that might be a football player who's lined up ready to run a route, and the defensive back opposite him is talking to him, saying stuff. Mm-hmm. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter for the successful execution of that play.
Sure.
But it's a distraction. But a relevant distraction would be the quarterback calling an audible, which changes the play. It's a distraction in that it took you off your initial and, if you will, primary task of running the proper route. But it's relevant because you have to listen to it because it might be telling you to run a different route. So we look at those types of distractions interactively through the system so that you have to respond to some and you don't have to respond to others. And again, fundamentally, what we're looking at is, did the decision making either A, get less accurate, lose accuracy, or B, get slower? And then we work in that environment to help the athletes train that skill, again, in a loaded environment, such that they can come close to matching the same performance in a quiet environment.
So can you tell us about some of the results you've achieved? Like, I mean, for people that have been undergoing this training, how's it working?
Yeah, it's one of the most fundamental pieces of information that we saw early on when we started developing these programs and training athletes was when we would have an athlete go into the real world and transfer the skill. Let's say it's pitch recognition, which is a skill that we train in hitting, and they come back and they talk about, boy, the pitches seemed slower today. The ball seemed bigger today.
That's great.
The common theme that we hear from athletes is the game slowed down, and it's very intriguing. And I know that's anecdotal, but what's to me very intriguing about that is that anybody who's played sports has felt that sensation, and we all know the game doesn't slow down.
Yeah.
And so, it's processing information more quickly. So that's one of our first responses is from athletes and the effect they're feeling, subconsciously, if you will. Additionally, in for example, baseball, we've within the clients we've worked with, we saw improvements in batting performance across just about every category. And one thing we're always careful about in sports is attributing one event to a very specific single outcome in a game.
Sure.
There's a million variables at play. So what we look at are the trends. We look at how athletes come in when they first assess, how they compare to athletes who are performing at a higher level on the field or the pitch, and then identify that tracks with their the level of performance we expected to see through our cognitive testing, and then training and seeing them improve in the training, and then getting the practice feedback or game feedback that they're grading out better. And so we feel very strongly this is having an effect. We're seeing the effect. We're seeing that athletes are making better decisions, but we know it's part of the puzzle. There are a lot of variables that go into hitting a baseball, and this is one of them.
I guess I'm wondering, and the answer might be 100%, but like, of people that are playing, let's say, professional sports in the United States right now, what percentage of those players are doing some sort of actual like cognitive training?
It's a great question. It probably comes down to how you define cognitive training.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured.
I would say all of them are getting huge amounts of cognitive training through coaching. Their coaches are spending time with them. They're watching film. They're studying playbooks. They're going to batting practice. It's all cognitive training at the end of the day. How many are getting a very specifically formulated, if you will, train above the neck type training? Mm-hmm. Very few.
Yeah.
And that's where we have focused. And in fact, that's it. I mentioned train above the neck. We went through a process of trying to just define what we're doing, and what is the relevant task, to represent cognitive training in sports. And really what stuck with athletes and with us is that we're training above the neck. Although practice and all of that happens physically, they also go to the weight room and lift weights.
Sure.
Very few are going out in the practice field, going to the weight room, lifting weights, and then going home and doing mental training. That's what we're looking to try and change.
Thank you so much to Jason Sada and Axon Sports for that interview. I am going to be looking for an opportunity to get myself to one of the mini cities that they've got installations in, and yeah, see exactly what one of these facilities looks like from the inside. I would love to do a follow-up episode as I'm mentally training myself for lightning strikes of fingers across keyboard keys or whatever it is the closest thing that I need for high athletic performance would be. But I think it's very, very cool that a company like that exists and that people at the top of their industries, in this case the athletics industry, are recognizing the power of brain training. And now, as promised, the on theme ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Okay, so the uncharacteristic television recommendation installment of the ruthless listener retention gimmick. I'm going to recommend a show called You Don't Know Bo. You guys remember Bo Jackson? Some of you might remember Bo Jackson. If you were around, I was a kid during the 1980s, and Bo Jackson was a big sports superstar. Then he was this guy that played both football and baseball at a professional level, like a super professional level. Just a tremendous athlete. You know, and I kind of remember him being this awesome guy from when I was a kid, but didn't really know the full story. And ESPN made a really solid 90-minute documentary on his career, which was really cut short by an injury that he had, more or less at the peak of his powers. But anyway, somebody recommended this to me. I started watching it thinking I would watch it for 15 minutes while I was eating dinner, and just kind of got sucked in. And wow, what an absolutely just amazing story this guy has. I figure for anybody that's into the nootropics and the personal optimization, just looking at somebody that is a literal sort of Superman type, which Bo Jackson inarguably was, I'd be surprised if you guys don't find it interesting.
Smart Drug Smarts.
You heard it. That is the episode. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you could always leave us a review on iTunes. I think we got a link on the website that will exactly guide you through that process if you're feeling good Samaritan-ish. The show notes for this episode, including the link to that Bo Jackson movie that I liked so much, will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com. I will be back at you next week, and we will be talking about the wonders of fish oil. Yes, fish oil, something that we've talked about a little bit before on lots of different episodes, but this time we're going to have a bona fide fish oil expert on the show telling us what it can do for our brains. Until then, have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.